The Ashes of Creation drama has gone insane. There's lawsuits, there's insults, and there's much more. What I'm going to do here is explain it in simple terms to give you a bit of a running update as to where we are right now. As you probably know, Intrepid Studios are effectively no more. There was a whole drama previously. Steven resigned, the devs got the warn notice and effectively were laid off and weren't getting paid for a month. And the dust had pretty much settled with a let's wait and see what happens to these lawsuits and the statements from the people involved. Well, we have some statements from the people involved. We have the lawsuit from the devs, which is basically the devs filing effectively a counter to the warn, which says, hey, you didn't give us enough time, enough warning, and you actually didn't pay us, so pay us. That's the devs effectively versus Intrepid. And then now we have a company called, I think, TFE Game Holdings. This appears to be primarily owned by a guy called Rob D. Dawson, and it is that entity which we think now controls the asset of Ashes of Creation. How did we get to that point? Well, that's a story in itself. But the TFE Game Holdings are suing Steven Sharif and his husband John Moore. That's sort of been one of the big nuclear bombs, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But another thing has also happened. Effectively, there was a guy called Jason Karmanis who has been given a lot of screenshots and documents to a YouTuber called NefastQS. And that has been rather explosive in its own right. So let's start with the lawsuit first. The lawsuit, I said, is from this TFE Game Holdings who now own Intrepid. They are suing Steven and John, and the things that they are suing them for are actually kind of wild. First, they basically want access to the platforms that they should have access to. Like, they don't have the login details to Steam, Discord, all the kinds of stuff, right? So they're like, hey, give us that. Effectively, they also say that Steven and John were embezzling money from Intrepid and the investors in Intrepid. Now, big caveat here, obviously, I'm now using these legal terms and stuff like that. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what I'm talking about. But these are only allegations. These are, we think this has happened. We want to try and prove it in court. We want the information that helps us prove it, and we're suing them for that. But it's not proven. This is obviously not a rebuttal. We've not heard anything from Steven or John. It's just the allegations from TFE Holdings, who we think is owned by Rob. But they're saying you embezzled money, basically. You took money from investors, you put it into Intrepid, and then you took it out of Intrepid. They also say that Steven was mixing his own money, his personal funds, with Intrepid's funds, which is very dubious territory. In fact, they say that there was $17.4 million of misappropriated funds. Funds that didn't go to the project, effectively, didn't go into the running of Ashes of Creation, and they want it back. And there's an accusation that I'm not sure is in the lawsuit or from Jason Karmanis or possibly both, but there's an accusation of effectively Steven and Intrepid using one loan as a income on a balance sheet, and then using that to get a bigger loan from a bigger bank, which would be incredibly illegal. I'm not a lawyer, but I think that sounds pretty illegal to me. That sounds like proper fraud. Again, all of this is alleged. There's another one where apparently a property was bought with Intrepid funds. That property was then sold, and then Steven has taken that money, which doesn't sound like that would be a done thing, does it? So there's all kinds of stuff in that lawsuit, but effectively the gist is the people who own Intrepid now are very annoyed at Steven. There's not enough evidence at this point from my perspective where I could have any sensible opinion based just on that lawsuit. Apparently the exhibits that were attached, they're not any detailed receipts or anything like that. They basically say, we think this is happening. I'm assuming there's something called discovery. Maybe I've watched too many TV shows, but I kind of feel like they need to go to the discovery where they actually get the documents and they get the information, and then they can possibly actually make their case. So that lawsuit in itself is pretty damn explosive. The fallout of that could be huge. We haven't heard Steven's reply. We haven't heard John reply. But, that sounds pretty crazy. And then we get into something else. Now, we get into a person called John Karmanis, and he basically sent a lot of texts and conversations from himself and Steven to a guy called NefastQS. And he's done an incredible YouTube video. It's an hour and 20 minutes long though, but if you really want all the juice, you'd have to go and watch that one pretty much. I'd watch maybe Kira for the lawsuit or Theory Forge for the lawsuit, and then Nefast for that. But keep in mind, you'll be watching, there's hours of content out there if you really want it. I think I spoke about this on stream today for about 8 hours. So there's details there if you really want the details. I'm kind of going to skirt over a little bit just in the interest of time. So I'll shut up and let's do it. So the video that Nefas today published was all the documents between him and Steven, and there was a lot just in that. There was it's a very long video, as I said, but effectively it's Steven asking Jason, and it's not me, even though my name actually is Jason. It's effectively Steven asking Jason for money. Now, if you are to believe that, I'm going to try and paint the story of what happened. But effectively, in around about 2014, Jason and another investor, there's loads of investors involved in this, start giving him money, and they end up making the start of the game, the prototypes, the things that's prepped for Kickstarter. So they're 4 million in, 2 million each, these investors. Then they go to Kickstarter, and that's where everything kicks off. No pun intended. From that point on, Steven gets really excited. He thinks that this game is going to be absolutely huge, bigger than World of Warcraft. He's happy Forbes has put them in the top wanted list and stuff like that, the highest hyped MMOs. And they're effectively riding a little bit of success. They're like, yes, boys, we're doing it. And that attracts more investment. Now, there appears to be more investment from a lot of people that may or may not have come forward, but specifically Jason is getting what we were calling love bombed. A lot of the times it would be like Steven messaging Jason going, hey, bro, I love you more than my own family. You are amazing. You're like a god to me. Also, please, can I have $500,000 to make payroll this month? And it's a lot of that. I'm kind of paraphrasing there, but some of what I just said is actually in those texts. And then Jason would be like, yeah, sure. And then sometimes he'd be like, I'm broke, mate. I'm completely tapped out. I need to sell my crypto or what have you. I need to sell my cars. And then they just have a back and forth where that continues effectively from 2014, what appears to be apparently up until about 2021. Again, this is a guy called Jason. Whilst Nefas actually validated who that guy is, I can't validate that the texts are 100% real, so you need to keep it with a pinch of salt. This guy then went on to do a live stream with Nefas, and there was more details that came out. And quite frankly, it sounds like he has like a serious vendetta against Steven, which, you know, logically makes sense, but his anger might be putting things that aren't true. So I just want you to keep that in mind. I'm not saying they aren't true. I'm not saying they are true, but he's obviously very angry at Steven, and that might be tainting something a little bit, okay? In the live stream call that he had with Nefas, he was very aggressive towards Steven. A lot of names were coming out. Cockroach and much, much worse. Now, on the surface, what Jason was saying effectively, it's not that bad, right? He was taking money from investors, and there was terrible interest rates, terrible business decisions, all kinds of stuff there, right? But in theory, Steven was desperately trying to keep getting money in so he could make payroll for the team that was actually working on the game. That inherently isn't necessarily any wrongdoing there, but the wrongdoing is obviously kind of suggested, and the misappropriation of funds kind of hinted at throughout. Now, during his time speaking with Steven and Jason, what actually transpired is Jason was saying that he was kind of lied to a little bit in certain times, but they're not necessarily easy to prove. For example, Steven was apparently talking about some deals that he had with Tencent, although that maybe fell through, and it came with another Chinese company, and then they weren't paying him, and Steven was very, very unfavorable. Kind of racist a little bit, in my opinion, if the statements are true, if the texts are real about the Chinese, like they're very uncalled for. But he's very angry about the Chinese for not getting their funds. And there's apparently quite a few other investors, and I'm not necessarily sure all of the investors knew each other. But anyway, so Steven might have been lying about deals, may not have been, maybe they actually fell through. There were things where he was saying, oh, I'm actually going to be talking at GDC this year, or PAX this year, and then they never did, although sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. Like, they were doing event presentations, but then they never materialized. There was some things about like paying Team Liquid to play the game, and it all just looked like a bad deal. I think from what I saw between Steven and Jason, in the actual video from Nefas, where it was actually the communications, it looks diabolical from Steven, but you could argue that it was pretty much just absolute like incompetence, potentially weaponized incompetence, but incompetence nonetheless. There are times where that might not have been the case, and he was just straight up lying to Jason. Very hard to judge from what we've seen. Jason effectively claims that he was primarily funding the game from 2014 to around about 2021. And at that point, they had lots of fallouts, and then they were making up. He apparently also then introduced Steven with a guy called Rob D. Dawson. Whilst Jason was in this for around about 10 and a bit million, Rob eventually apparently has spent around about 80 to 90 million of his own money to invest in the studio. And effectively it was Rob from about 2022 to now. Plus, I'm assuming a lot of other smaller investors whose names we kind of know, but we don't really know the full impact of that. It's worth noting that both Rob, Jason, Steven's mum, everybody's kind of involved in that. And pretty much everybody involved has a MLM background, a multi-level marketing scheme, which some of you might instantly be like, well, they're scammers. And you're not immediately wrong. Jason kind of seemed unabashed by that, but was claiming that he'd moved on from it in the same breath. So a little bit hard to believe there. He did actually say, he's like, I'm very happy with it. I made loads of millionaires. I'm very confident and happy with what I've done. I mean, yeah, you made quite a few millionaires, but whose money did they take to become a millionaire? That would be the question. Anyway, I'll let you guys think about that answer. At one point, Jason alleges that Jason and Rob effectively saved Steven Sharif's house by giving him several $1 million. Not sure why Jason would have done this if he was completely out. Seems like he wasn't out. And you might be like wondering, why did these people not get out earlier? Well, the idea being that they'd invested so much that they didn't want to throw it into the wind and just destroy everything. You might say sunk cost fallacy, but sometimes it's not a fallacy. Like if you're building a house and you're 95% done and you run out of money, might be worth getting a bank loan to actually finish it to then sell the house. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, in this case, it was obviously a sunk cost fallacy because it never actually materialized. But anyway, apparently they took some money to save Steven's house. Now, there's a whole thing about Steven's house. People are alleging that it was sold to his husband. I don't think that's the property mentioned from the previous lawsuit, but technically I guess it could be. I simply don't know the details of that, and I don't think anybody knows what is fully accurate yet, so I'm just going to gloss over it now because I don't know. And I think that basically takes us up to around about January. And this is where everything comes to a head. Rob says, I'm pretty much tapped out, I've got no money. Jason's kind of tapped out, he's had no money, he doesn't want to be involved. And Rob effectively creates this TFE Game Holdings, I'm sorry if I forgot the name. And what they say to Steven is, I'm going to default on you, as in like, you can't pay me because I know you can't pay me. We've spent like 140 million. I think it's actually 110 million they think they've had from investors, and then 30 odd million from people like me and you. But anyway, they say, we're going to just take control of the company. Their plan effectively is to get all the investors who can to put in an extra 25%. They'll lay off all the devs and then hire them back to the new company. And they would effectively just push for release. And they say to Steven, this is pretty much the only option. Steven says, I would like some equity in this new plan. Rob says, you ain't having any, because when you look at all of the investments that are alleged, possibly didn't put anything in, even though they had like 4% of the company. So Steven resigns. The company then is left with a bit of a tricky situation. And then there's a murky thing with the money from Steam. So Jason alleges, and again, keep in mind, a lot of this is allegedly, and we don't actually know the facts, but Jason alleges that the house is tied up with, there's some money in that they can't get out, and some of it is in escrow, held by a third party, which I think is the bank. Now, how is that tied up with Steam? Well, it shouldn't be. But apparently, when Steven resigns, he then contacts the bank to tell the bank, hey, don't pay these guys. Your money that is in my house, you can just take it from that. They then contact Steam, and either the money gets held up or the money gets freed and sent to those people. I actually don't know that. It's not very clear right now. We don't know what happened with the money from Steam. Big question mark there. And I think that's effectively the whole story, except obviously it's nowhere near the whole story. There's those parties, TFE and Rob Dawson, which appears to be like one and the same, and all of the other smaller investors. There's Jason Karmanis, who is just absolutely lashing out, which fair play. Apparently he's down like over $10 million, so kind of makes sense to be very angry, and he's just putting Steven on blast. And there is the bank and all the other investors. Okay, now how much of that is true, how much of that is real, how much is Steven responsible? All of this we don't really know until we see Steven's reply. And what I suspect is we're going to get a lot more lawsuits. Jason's got to file his, probably all of the other investors will file theirs. Steven might file his against TFE or whoever the hell he thinks the board was. And speaking of the board, Jason effectively said, I don't think there ever was a board, and if there was a board, I wasn't part of it, and I should have been because I was 10 million deep. Although it sounds like a lot of people think there was a board, but maybe Jason just wasn't privy to that. Or it could be there was apparently a meeting when they decided to make this TFE company and give Steven the deal. That was a call, maybe a board call, technically, maybe not. So that's where we're up to right now. A lot of if, buts, maybes, what is this real, what have you. For me, there's a lot of questions that Steven simply must answer if he wants to be taken seriously. First question, why did you tell everybody that you didn't have any investors when it's quite clear at this point it seems like you did? Now he's going to say, I probably always had like friends and family investors, which he did say he had friends and family investors. He'll probably say that these friends have turned on him. I mean, if you swim with the sharks, sometimes you get bit. And another question would be, how much of your own money did you invest? Jason said you pretty much did nothing, or you did 4 million of somebody's money, but it wasn't actually your money. Were you just straight up lying to everybody on the internet? Like so many people were taken in. Guys, if you weren't taken in and you sensed an MLM guy was scamming from the start, good for you. A lot of people were taken in. I think I was pretty much taken in. At one point, I had a YouTube channel dedicated to Ashes creation. I kind of stopped before Alpha 2 because I didn't believe in it, but I didn't sniff this. I didn't know this, right? I was kind of taken in by him and his charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent. Maybe not talent, maybe not nerve, maybe not uniqueness. I don't know what I was taken in by, actually. Was the Tencent deal real? Was the other China company deal real? That's an interesting one. Was he racist against the Chinese, or was he just lashing out in anger? I think he's just going to say I was lashing out in anger, but I mean, kind of dubiously. I mean, he almost reached inferior culture Asman levels. What happened with these Steam payments? Did you really gimp the devs by taking the money for yourselves and sorting out your own house? Interesting question. Are you now refusing to hand over all the business logins and stuff like that to TFE? And Jason said, and I didn't mention this earlier, but Jason said that they were taking $50,000 per month each as a wage. If that is true, why would you need to take a wage if you were funding it yourself? I mean, obviously you probably weren't funding it yourself if you believe these rumors, but yeah. And I guess the last question would be, did you actually misappropriate funds / embezzle? If I'm Steven, I'm either not going to answer those questions or I'm going to answer them in a way where I did nothing wrong. But that's where we are right now. Many questions, very little answers. I think right now, like, Steven is not coming out of this looking good. What he did to Jason, if those documents are real, kind of diabolical. If the lawsuit allegations are anywhere kind of reality as well, then, you know, mixing personal funds with business funds, taking money out of the company, etc., that would be, I mean, potentially criminal. But I think, as Kira often says, there's 3 sides to every story: their side, your side, and the truth. We've only heard one side, even though there's actually loads of parties involved. We've only really heard some of the investors' side. It's time for Steven to get suing so we can get some more information, please. I don't necessarily want to just milk the drama. I kind of like milking this on Twitch. I like talking about it on Twitch. But when it comes to YouTube, I feel a bit weird just milking drama. What I really want is an MMO that I really like and want to play a lot and make like content for it. Until then, I guess what we have is drama. But oh my god, it's big, juicy drama. This is one of the MMO stories of the last 20 years. It's huge. It's one of the biggest ever. And that's what we're up to right now. Have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.